Hello everyone, this is Dr. Manisha Mirdha and today I would be speaking on the topic Democracy, History of an Idea Part 2. To begin with, I start with a definition which was given by Bernard Crick, which says, democracy is perhaps the most promiscuous word in the world of public affairs. Now, we had seen in the last lecture of democracy that the term democracy was a very challenged concept and there was a lot of elasticity attached to this confusing term. We would say elasticity because people have expanded the connotation of the term to suit their own interests and to suit their own interpretations. However, when I come back to the definition given by Bernard Crick, which says democracy is the most promiscuous word. Now, why does he say that? Why does he explain democracy in these terms? Promiscuous because democracy can mean different things to different people. Democracy has no consensus on the larger idea and different people associate the term democracy with different understandings. So, therefore, they say that the entire understanding of the word is very confusing. However, saying this, we also have to understand that the understanding of democracy is very wide. There are different models which try to explain democracy and all of them are inclusive in our today's understanding of democracy. So, for today's lecture, we would be dealing with the different models of democracy, and after getting into the details of the models of democracy, then we will try to understand the various challenges of democracy, the future of democracy, and we will finish our discourse on democracy with the role of free press in democracy. So, this would be the basic understanding of the concepts that we will be dealing with in today's lecture. Let us begin with the models of democracy. These are the models of democracy that we will be trying to explain in today's lecture: liberal democracy, elitist democracy, Marxist democracy, participatory democracy, developmental democracy, pluralist democracy, deliberative democracy, and in the end consociational democracies. So, we will try to gain a elaborate understanding of these terms that we have used over here. Let us begin with our understanding of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is a word which has been very frequently used by scholars, especially from the West, because for them this is the only feasible form of democracy which exists in today's time. In fact, if I had to quote Francis Fukuyama, who is one of the major political scientists of United States of America, he says in his work, which was titled as End of the State, he says that there has been a triumph of liberalism. This work came after the disintegration of USSR and the fall of communism. It was at that time where liberal democracy came as the only existing kind of idea of the governance of state. So, what exactly is liberal democracy? So, if I just read out a definition of liberal democracy, as you can see on the slide, which says it is a form of government and political system that combines liberal principles of individual rights, freedoms and the rule of law with the democratic process of representative governance. It is one of the most prevalent and widely adopted systems in the world today. Let me get into a few of the key features of liberal democracy. It says individual rights and freedoms. So, it places a strong emphasis on the individual freedom, the individual right of the people in the state. It talks about rule of law, which means that there is assurance that the same rules will be applied to all the people of the land. It talks about limited government, which says that the interference of the government should be limited, because more than required interference of the government can lead to tyranny. So, therefore, they talk about separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary and the legislature, and there are various measures of checks and balances which ensure that the political landscape functions in sync. There is another concept of free and fair elections. Now, free and fair elections again ensure that the people who have been put in that post, who represent the electorate, function properly, because if they do not, then the right of dethroning them is with the people. So, the concept of free and fair elections actually ensures accountability. There is this concept of civilian control of military, which basically means that the military forces are not involved in political decision making. Military is subordinate to civilian authority. Liberal democracy talks about pluralism and tolerance, which would talk about diversity of views. It embraces tolerance, it embraces a pluralist approach towards governance. So, different cultures can coexist together in a democracy. It talks about protection of minority rights, which means that the rights of the minority sections of the society which could be subjected to majority tyranny are taken care of and protection is given to them. And finally, independent judiciary. Independent judiciary is a very important, essential aspect of liberal democracy, a democracy which will interpret the laws for the benefit of the people. So, these are some of the key features of liberal democracy. Now, if I talk about elitist democracy, which is the second model of democracy, and the definition of the elitist democracies goes like this, that it is a concept within political theory that describes a form of governance where political power is concentrated in the hands of a small, privileged and influential group of individuals. In this system, a select few hold significant control and influence over the decision making process and policies of the government. The major proponents of this model of democracy have been Pareto, Mosca, Michels, to name a few. The key characteristics of elitist democracy would involve concentration of power, which means that there is power only with a few, and these few could be based on social status, could be based on wealth, could be based on political connections. So, whatever the reason might be, but the power is concentrated in the hands of a few. It talks about limited participation, which says that the involvement of all the people in the decision making process is not there. The decision making process is in the hands of a few limited people. Influence of special interest groups, which could be lobbyists, which could be corporations, and likewise. Then expert driven decision making, which says that the decisions might be taken by the technocrats or the people of the technical field, and the masses would not be included in the decision making process, which actually is against the ideal of democracy. And then oligarchy. So, the fear of elitist democracy turning into oligarchy is also strongly there. So yes, there can be various criticisms of this democracy, and it can lead to economic inequalities and the tyranny of the elite few over the majority. Then we talk about Marxist democracy. Now this refers to a political system that combines elements of Marxist theory and principles with democratic governance. It aims to establish a society based on the ideals of Marxism, of equality, collective ownership of the means of production, and the abolition of social classes. At the same time, it upholds democratic decision making processes and popular participation. Democratic Marxist or Marxist democracy is something which is an amalgam of democracies and traditional Marxism. Traditional Marxism were against democracies. They were against the hegemony which was created by these liberal democracies and which led to a very classed society termed into or categorized into the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois being the capitalist and the proletariat being the working class. So this is a Marxist democracy is a mix of traditional Marxism and the democratic principles, and the key principles of this kind of democracy would involve economic equality. It looks for a system where the working class collectively owns the means of production and the resources. It talks about a classless society which would aim towards eradicating the social classes and the class struggle and creating a society where everybody has equal rights and opportunities. It talks about a democratic decision making, which means that decision making can take at the most appropriate level, which could be a local level also. It talks about social welfare of the people of the community, and it also talks about overcoming alienation. Alienation as a consequence of the capitalist system, where workers would get disconnected from the labor that they are putting it, from the resources that they are using. And finally, revolutionary transformations, which talks about or rather proposes a revolution by the working class, which is necessary to ensure that the capitalists do not create a hegemony or a dependency, and eventually socialism flourishes in. The next kind of democracy is titled as participative democracy. It is also known as a political system that emphasizes the active involvement of citizens in decision making processes and governance. And in this model, citizens have the opportunity and the responsibility to directly participate in shaping policies, laws, and other aspects of public life. The key features of this participative model of democracy would involve citizen involvement, where the citizens are not just involved in voting, but apart from that in public decision making, in attending meetings of the state and contributing to the policy discussions. There is a very decentralized decision making process which takes place in this model of democracy, which can go down to the most local level if found to be appropriate. It talks about deliberation and dialogue. So, deliberation and dialogue is something which is encouraged, and people are encouraged to see that they give their inputs and they give their suggestions for the policy decision making process. It is a very inclusive representation which is a part of participative democracy, which says that a diverse range of citizens belonging to whichever caste, class or creed are all involved in the decision making process. There is use of technology which is appreciated, and there is a bottoms up approach a bottoms up approach is the opposite of tops down model. Top down model, which would basically mean that the decisions are coming from the government to the citizens, whereas this talks about a bottoms up approach, which means that the decisions and the suggestions will come from the people to the government, and it involves the voluntary associations, which could be the community organizations and the non-governmental groups in the making of the decision. Then we come to the next model, which is the developmental model of democracy. J.S. Mill and C.B. Macpherson, to name a few, have contributed a lot in this model of democracy. So, what is this developmental model of democracy? This model concentrates not just on the power and the functions of democracy, which would be protection of rights and liberties of people, but it also focuses or pays attention to the development of mental faculties of the people. So, according to Mill, this kind of democracy would be able to develop two kinds of qualities in people. One is a moral development and the other would be individual capacity. Individual capacity, which would be the argumentative power of people, the power to reason, the power to decide, the power to locate the right decisions for the state. So, democracy not just helps people to shape themselves morally, but also to inculcate the capacity to reason, to argue, to distinguish between right and wrong, and to be able to reach to logical deliberations. So, therefore, Mill actually argues that there are two kinds of behaviors that people indulge in. One is self-regarding, the other is other-regarding. And according to Mill, the government should only be incorporating its interference in the other-regarding behavior. As far as the self-regarding behavior is concerned, the government has no right to interfere. This is a personal space of the citizen and the government should not interfere, because such interference can lead to demoralization and not any enhancement of personality. So, these are some of the major postulates of developmental model of democracy. Then there is this pluralist democracy, which is also known as pluralism, and it is a form of democratic government that emphasizes the existence and recognition of diverse and competing interest groups within society. In a pluralist democracy, power is dispersed and diffused across various groups, which could be social, political, economic, cultural, and each having different interest, and these interests could be clubbed together in a pluralist democracy. So, basically pluralist democracy looks for a diverse participation of people. It talks about inclusivity, it talks about power distribution, it talks about compromise and negotiation, protection of minority rights and freedom of association. So, this is pluralist democracy. A similar form somewhat is deliberative democracy, which is a form of democracy which emphasizes the importance of informed and inclusive public deliberation in decision making process. It seeks to enhance democratic governance by opening way to rational discussions amongst citizens, stakeholders, policymakers, to name a few. And the key principles of deliberative democracy would include inclusiveness, reasoned discussion, equality, respectful engagement, and consideration of common good. And the last model of democracy, which is called consociational democracy, it is a form of power sharing political system designed to manage and reconcile deep seated social and political divisions within a society. The concept of such a democracy was first developed by the political scientist Aaron Lippert in the 1960s, and it is an alternative to majoritarian or winner takes all system kind of a governance. So, it seeks to promote again inclusivity and representation of all significant groups. The key features of this democracy being power sharing, proportional representation, grand coalition, minority veto, autonomy or federalism, and elite cooperation. Now, till now, as you have seen, we have talked about the various models of democracy, which gives us an understanding of the different connotations attached to this term and all existing together. So, the beauty of this again is that all conceptions of democracy coexist and flourish in different states differently. After which, let us also look into the major challenges of the democratic process and outcomes. So, we have in the last lecture talked about the benefits of democracy, and then also I had said that there are definitely challenges which we will be dealing with in our next lecture. Before I try to explain these terms which have been put on the slide, I would also like to go back and a kind of a recap of the various challenges which came in the entire conversation of the description of the term democracy. So, we realized that it was difficult to define the concept democracy. We realized that there is a different notion of substantive and procedural kind of democracy. We realized that there is a contrast between two notions of democracy which flourish together: democracy as an idea and democracy as a function. Sometimes there are certain people who discredit democracy as an idea itself completely. So, what I mean by that is that there are some people who believe that democracy as an idea itself is bad. In fact, if I just quote Aristotle, who was the father of political science, he thought democracy to be the most perverted form of government. So, this is what was said by Aristotle about democracy, the most perverted form of governance. But then for our better understanding, his idea of democracy was something which is close to our current understanding of mobcracy. Aristotle called polity to be the best form of government, which is what comes closest to our understanding of what democracy is today. But then coming back to what I was saying, that there are some people who consider it to be a bad system, who consider that it is impossible to reach to any consensus in this kind of a governance. There are people who believe that this kind of a system is something which gives way to manipulation, polarization and coercion. So, this is the background of the challenges which are there, but now if I just talk about the major challenges which we can face in a democratic process, the first one being political instability. As we all know and as we have seen in our own country, that sometimes the governments form coalition governments which are always at risk of political instability. So, within this political instability, sometimes they come up with compromised decisions which can lead to problems of development, problems of investment and welfare. So, this kind of political instability is something which is inherent in the idea of democracy. Another problem which might emerge in a democracy is the short term goals. Now, we all know that governments come with an expiry date. So, whatever policies that they come up with is usually for their own benefit, keeping in view the next elections. So, in this entire process, the problem which comes is that the policies which require a long term planning get a backseat. So, there could be problems of climate, there could be problems of social transformations which require a long term planning, but governments would not indulge into that because that is something which does not give them any short term benefit. So, the problem is that because of the short term goals, the policies come in a very compromised manner. Another problem of democracy is illiteracy and economic inequality. So, the voter holds a very important position, but the significance of his vote is something which is not realized by a voter who is not literate, aware and participative in the entire political process of the country. So, what happens that this voter who is illiterate, his vote could be misused and manipulated by muscle and power. So, therefore, money, muscle and power, they play a very influential and a very manipulative role in deciding the fate of democracies, because the power lies with the voter who is not aware of the significance of the vote that he carries with him. So, therefore, this is another problem, and another interesting challenge which is there of democratic process is something which is a term which has been coined in the recent few years, which is called post-truth politics. Now, what is this post-truth politics? As I said, this is a recent phenomena, and the term was coined by Jason Harrison in 2015. So, what is the meaning of this term post-truth politics? So, what this means is that there are leaders who appeal to the emotions of the voters. There are leaders who appeal to the psychological predispositions of the voters, which might be completely away from facts. And especially in the era of social media that we are living in, where people can repeat the same point, and if they have good oratory skills, then they provide enough proof of a concept which actually is completely different from the fact, and people believe in this. So, we can say that post-truth regimes give us a scope to make the points even when the point does not exist, and the truth might be ignored or doctored differently. I will just look into the last point of today's lecture, which is the relationship between free press and democracy. So, it is very important that this relationship between democracy and free press is taken care of in such a system, because for effectiveness, transparency and accountability of government, it is very important that the system of free press is there. If I just quote Thomas Jefferson, who says, "Our liberty depends on the freedom of press." So, the guardian and protector of our liberty is the free press. So, if I had to summarize today's lecture, I would start by the basic point where we said that democracy itself is a very elastic concept having different meanings to it. After which we dealt with the various models of democracy. We tried to gain an elaborate understanding of all the models which coexist in today's time, giving it a very varied understanding. After which we tried to look into some challenges of democracy, like political instability, short-term goals, illiteracy and economic inequality, post-truth politics, to name a few. So, these were some of the challenges that we talked about today. I hope you had a good understanding of the concept of democracy, the models and the challenges. Thank you.